silence fell over the underground club the moment she stepped through the mahogany doors. 30 heavily armed men had expected a sculpted supermodel, a superficial peace offering, to smooth over a fractured multi-million-dollar syndicate dispute. Instead, they saw her. A fiercely intelligent, plus-sized black woman, clutching a leather-bound ledger, sent as a twisted joke by an arrogant rival boss to insult Tai-Sik Kwon, the deadliest man on the West Coast. Cruel, mocking laughter immediately erupted from the soldiers. But that laughter died instantly the second the Korean boss stood up. He didn't smile. He simply locked eyes with her, unbuttoned his bespoke Tom Ford suit jacket. An absolute terror suffocated the room. Noel Dubois was not a woman who blended into the background. In the sterile, hypermasculine world of underground logistics and forensic accounting, she was an anomaly. She was a brilliant, curves-for-days black woman with a mind like a steel trap and an eye for numbers that had saved the Belmont crime family from federal indictments on 3 separate occasions. Yet to Richard Belmont, the newly minted, profoundly arrogant underboss of the Belmont Syndicate, she was nothing more than a punchline. Richard was a man who inherited his empire rather than building it. He operated out of a sprawling compound in the Hollywood Hills, managing the family's West Coast expansion with all the finesse of a wrecking ball. His worldview was narrow-shaped by superficiality and inherited wealth. To him, women were arm candy accessories to be displayed at high-stakes poker tables in Las Vegas, or traded like currency among rival factions. Noel, with her thick thighs, full hips, an absolute refusal to shrink herself for anyone's comfort, infuriated him simply by existing in his proximity. The trouble started when Richard decided to skim profits off a joint shipping venture at the port of Long Beach. The venture wasn't just any operation. It was co-owned by the Kangpei, the Korean Mafia faction controlled by Tai-Sik Kwon. Tai-Sik was an enigma in the Los Angeles underworld. Unlike the boisterous Italian-American mobsters who loved flashy cars and loud threats, Tai-Sik was a ghost. He operated with terrifying precision, running a multi-billion-dollar empire encompassing real estate tech fronts and international shipping. When Tai-Sik's auditors noticed a $4 million discrepancy, the message sent to Richard Belmont was simple, polite, and completely devoid of warmth. Explain the missing funds or forfeit your territory. Panic had gripped the Belmont compound. Richard didn't have the money. He had blown it on bad crypto investments and a fleet of custom sports cars. He needed to buy time, and in his twisted, panicked mind, he concocted a plan that he thought was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. "We send him an emissary," Richard had announced, pacing the floor of his penthouse office, his lackeys hanging onto every word. "A peace offering. The Koreans are big on face right, on respect. They expect a beautiful, delicate little thing to bat her eyelashes and beg for an extension." Richard had stopped pacing, a cruel, sneering smile spreading across his face as his eyes landed on Noel, who was sitting in the corner, desperately trying to balance the compromised ledgers. "So we send them Noel." The room of mobsters had erupted into snickers. Noel had frozen her pen hovering over the paper. "Send me!" Noel asked, her voice steady, despite the sudden spike in her heart rate. "I'm an accountant, Richard. I don't do field negotiations, especially not with the Kangpei." "Oh, but you're perfect, Noel." Richard had mocked, leaning over her desk, the smell of expensive cologne and cheap whiskey rolling off him. Tai-Sik is a perfectionist, a snob. He surrounds himself with sleek, silent perfection. I want to see the look on his face when my gift walks through the door. A fat, loud accountant. It's a statement. It tells him exactly what I think of his threats. It was a death sentence disguised as a cruel joke. Richard was deliberately insulting one of the most ruthless men in the country using Noel's weight and her race as the punchline. She was meant to be humiliated, laughed out of the room, or worse, killed by an insulted crime boss. Noel wanted to quit right then and there. She wanted to throw the ledger in his face and walk out into the California sun. But Richard knew her leverage. Her younger sister Maya was in a private residential care facility in Malibu, battling a severe autoimmune disease. The Belmont family paid for the facility. It was blood money, but it kept Maya alive. "You do this," Richard had whispered his tone, dropping the faux humour, "and Maya's bills are paid for the next 5 years. You refuse, and I pull her funding today. Try finding a corporate job that covers 30 grand a month in medical bills." So Noel did the only thing she could do. She prepared for war. If she was going to be marched into the lion's den as a joke, she would not give them the satisfaction of looking like a punchline. She spent hours getting ready for the meeting. She bypassed the standard drab business attire and chose a bespoke tailored emerald green suit that cinched at her waist and flared over her hips. She wore her natural hair in a fierce high updo, her makeup sharp and flawless. She packed the real ledgers, the ones proving Richard's incompetence, into her briefcase. If she was going down, she was taking Richard Belmont with her. The meeting was set for midnight at the Onyx Room, a highly exclusive subterranean club buried deep beneath the bustling streets of Koreatown. The club was a fortress, accessible only via a private elevator hidden behind the kitchen of a Michelin-starred barbecue restaurant. Noel stood in the metal box of the elevator, the low hum of the descent vibrating through the soles of her stilettos. Beside her stood 2 of Richard's men, Rowan and Kai. They were typical Belmont muscle, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, and possessing a combined IQ that barely rivaled room temperature. They had spent the entire car ride making thinly veiled fat-phobic jokes at her expense, placing bets on how fast Tae-sik Kwon would throw her out. "Just remember your lines, sweetheart," Rowan sneered, adjusting his poorly fitted suit. "You walk in, you hand over the fake ledger, and you tell him Richard sends his heaviest regards." Kai snorted a laugh, elbowing Rowan. Noel stared straight ahead at the brushed steel doors, her expression unreadable. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she focused on the weight of the briefcase in her hand. "Just breathe," she told herself. "You know the numbers, you know the truth." The elevator pinged softly, and the doors slid open to reveal a world that smelled of expensive cigar smoke, spilled bourbon, and ozone. The Onyx Room was vast, bathed in deep crimson and violet neon lighting. The aesthetic was a flawless blend of modern, industrial, and traditional Korean opulence. Men in immaculate dark suits lined the perimeter of the room. There was no loud music, no chaotic dancing, just the low, dangerous murmur of serious men doing serious business. As Rowan and Kai stepped out flanking Noel, the room's attention slowly pivoted toward them. The murmurs died down. 30 pairs of cold, calculating eyes swept over the trio. Noel felt the immediate shift in the atmosphere. The Belmont men puffing out their chests meant nothing here. They were heavily outnumbered and severely outclassed. At the far end of the room, sitting on a raised platform in a semicircular leather booth, was Tae-sik Kwon. Even seated, his presence dominated the vast space. He was breathtakingly handsome in a harsh, unforgiving way. His jawline was sharp, his dark hair styled back with meticulous precision. He wore a tailored charcoal 3-piece suit without a tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone, revealing a glimpse of intricate tattoos trailing up his collarbone. He was swirling a glass of amber liquid, his dark eyes fixed on the entrance. When his gaze landed on Noel, he stopped swirling his drink. Rowan puffed out his chest and marched forward, treating the room like he owned it. Mr. Kwon. Rowan projected his voice grating against the quiet elegance of the club. We're here on behalf of Richard Belmont. Tae-sik did not say a word. He didn't even look at Rowan. His eyes were entirely focused on Noel. It wasn't a look of disgust, nor was it the leering, predatory gaze she was used to from men in this life. It was an analytical, penetrating stare. He was dissecting her presence, calculating the variables. Come forward. A man standing to Tae-sik's right commanded. He was clearly the right-hand man, lean-scarred, and holding a suppressed sidearm loosely by his thigh. Rowan grabbed Noel's arm, roughly pulling her forward, until they stood just a few feet from Tae-sik's table. Noel ripped her arm out of Rowan's grasp, smoothing her emerald jacket with a dignified calm she didn't know she possessed. Mr. Belmont couldn't make it, Rowan said, a nasty smirk playing on his lips. He looked around the room, making eye contact with Tae-sik's men as if they were all in on the same joke. He said you guys were worried about the weight of the new shipments at the port, so he figured he'd send you something substantial. A heavy anchor for your operations, you could say. Rowan gestured grandly to Noel. Here she is, Richard's personal tribute to the Kangpai. Don't worry, she doesn't eat that much. The silence in the room stretched. It was thick, suffocating. Kai let out a nervous chuckle. From the back of the room, one of the younger, less disciplined Korean foot soldiers let out a sharp, mocking snort of laughter. It was a domino effect. Within seconds, low, rumbling chuckles echoed off the mahogany walls. They were laughing at her. The Belmont men were grinning triumphant in their pathetic, orchestrated humiliation. Noel stood frozen. The heat of embarrassment flushed her cheeks, but she bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. She would not cry. She would not look down. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stared directly into the eyes of the deadliest man in Los Angeles. Tae-sik Kwon did not laugh. The low chuckles echoing through the onyx room seemed to grate against his nerves. He slowly set his crystal glass down on the glass table. The clink was soft, but in the echoing chamber it sounded like a gunshot. He raised his right hand just an inch. Instantly, the laughter in the room vanished. The younger foot soldier who had started it looked down terrified. Rowan's smug grin faltered his eyes darting around the room as the atmosphere plummeted from tense to lethal. Tae-sik finally stood up. He was incredibly tall, moving with the fluid, predatory grace of a big cat. He stepped down from the raised platform, closing the distance between himself and Noel. He stopped barely a foot away from her. Up close, he smelled of cedarwood gunpowder and something entirely intoxicating. He didn't look at her body. He looked at her eyes. He saw the defiance there, the blazing intellect, and the desperate hidden terror she was fighting so hard to suppress. Then his gaze drifted down to the leather-bound briefcase in her hands. "You are Richard Belmont's accountant," Tae-sik said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, lightly accented and incredibly smooth. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Noel's breath hitched. "He knows who I am." "I am," Noel replied, her voice remarkably steady. "My name is Noel Dubois." "I know who you are, Ms. Dubois," Tae-sik said softly, though the room was so quiet everyone could hear him. "I know that 3 years ago you restructured Belmont's shell companies in Delaware to evade a RICO charge. I know that 18 months ago you streamlined their logistics network, cutting their overhead by 20%. You are the only reason that family of incompetent pigs is still solvent." Rowan shifted uncomfortably. "Hey, watch it, Kwon. We came here to give you the ledgers." Tae-sik didn't even turn his head. "Ji-hoon!" The scarred man on Tae-sik's right moved in a blur, Before Rowan could even blink, Ji-hoon had crossed the space, driving the butt of his suppressed pistol directly into Rowan's jaw. The sickening crunch of bone echoed loudly. Rowan collapsed to the floor like a sack of wet cement, groaning in agony, blood pooling on the pristine tiles. Kai panicked, reaching for his jacket, but 4 laser sights instantly painted his chest red. He froze, his hands trembling in the air. Noel flinched but didn't take a step back. She held her ground. Taysik kept his eyes locked on Noel, completely ignoring the bleeding man on the floor. "Richard sent you here to insult me," Taysik stated calmly. "He looks at you and sees a punchline because he is a small, stupid man who values packaging over the product. He thinks sending a woman who does not fit his pathetic, narrow standard of beauty will somehow wound my pride." Taysik took a slow step closer to Noel. The intensity radiating off him was overwhelming, but Richard has made a fatal miscalculation. Taysik continued his voice, dropping an octave meant only for her ears now. "He handed me the brain of his entire operation wrapped in emerald green. He handed me the only woman in his syndicate who actually knows where the missing $4 million is." Taysik slowly reached out his large, scarred hand, gently wrapping around the handle of Noel's briefcase. His knuckles brushed against hers, sending a jolt of electricity up her arm. "Is it in here, Miss Dubois?" he asked softly. "The real ledger, not the fabricated garbage he told you to give me, but the one you prepared to save your own life." Noel's eyes widened. He was entirely too perceptive. She let go of the briefcase, allowing him to take it. "It's on page 42, she whispered. He didn't skim 4 million, he skimmed 6. He routed 2 million through a crypto tumbler to a private offshore account in the Caymans. The account numbers are in the margins." A slow, terrifyingly beautiful smile spread across Taysik's face. It was the smile of a wolf that had just been handed the keys to the slaughterhouse. He turned around, opening the briefcase on the glass table. He flipped exactly to page 42, his eyes scanning the impeccable numbers she had written. He closed it with a snap. Taysik looked down at Rowan, who was clutching his shattered jaw, spitting blood. "Tell Richard." Taysik commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "that I accept his tribute. The debt is settled." Rowan blinked through his pain. What? "Tell him." Taysik continued, stepping back to Noel's side and firmly yet gently placing a protective hand on the small of her back. "That Miss Dubois belongs to the Kangpai now. She is under my personal protection. If Richard or any Belmont soldier attempts to contact her, look at her, or breathe near her sister's facility in Malibu, I will burn his compound to the ground with him inside it." Rowan's eyes widened in horror. Kai was practically shaking. "Get out of my club," Taysik spat. The 2 Belmont men scrambled to their feet, dragging each other toward the elevator, fleeing for their lives. The heavy steel doors closed behind them, sealing them out. The room was silent again. Noel stood there, her mind spinning. He knew about Maya. He knew everything. She looked up at Taysik, the man who was supposed to execute her, who had just claimed her instead. "Why?" she breathed out. Taysik looked down at her, his dark eyes softening just a fraction. His thumb traced a light circle against the fabric of her suit at her back. "Because Noel," he said quietly, "in my world, true power isn't about fitting into a mold. It's about surviving the people trying to force you into one. And you just brought me the head of my enemy on a silver platter." He extended his arm toward the private dining area. "Now, have you eaten? We have much to discuss about your new salary." The transition from captive to kingmaker happened overnight. Noel Dubois did not wake up the next morning in a dungeon or a Stark warehouse, but in the sprawling, sun-drenched guest suite of Tai-Sik Kwon's penthouse atop the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Los Angeles. When she stepped out of the bedroom, dressed in a silk robe provided by the household staff, she found Tai-Sik sitting at a massive marble dining table. Before him lay a spread of traditional Korean breakfast dishes, but his focus was entirely on the 6 glowing monitors set up on the adjacent desk. He was already working. "Good morning, Ms. Dubois," Tai-Sik said without looking away from the screens. "Eat. Then we dismantle Richard Belmont." Noel sat at the table pouring herself a cup of black coffee. The terror of the previous night had faded, replaced by a cold, calculating adrenaline. For years, she had been forced to use her brilliance to shield a man who despised her. Now she was being asked to use it as a weapon. "Richard is stupid, but he's paranoid," Noel said, setting her cup down. "He has dead man switches on the main accounts. If he suspects I've defected, he'll freeze the Cayman assets and move the liquid cash to a secondary vault in Zurich." Tai-Sik finally turned to look at her. In the daylight, without the neon glare of the Onyx room, he was even more striking. "He already suspects," Tai-Sik replied smoothly. "My men intercepted a communication an hour ago. Richard ordered a hit on you. When his spotters realized you never returned to your apartment, he panicked. He is currently scrambling his men." Noel's blood ran cold. The coffee turned to ash in her mouth. "Maya!" she gasped, shooting up from the chair. "My sister. If he can't find me, he'll go to the recovery center in Malibu. He uses her to control me. He'll hurt her, Tai-Sik. We have to go." "Noel, sit down." His voice was not a yell, but it carried an absolute unyielding authority that stopped her in her tracks. Tai-Sik pressed a button on his phone, bringing up a live security feed on one of the large monitors. It showed a luxurious sunlit hospital room overlooking the ocean. Sitting in the bed, watching a movie and laughing with a pair of armed, heavily tattooed Korean nurses was Maya. "I dispatched Ji-hoon to the Malibu facility at 3 in the morning, Tai-Sik explained calmly, walking over and standing beside her. "We extracted your sister, paid her medical bills for the next 10 years in advance, and relocated her to a private secure wing of Cedars-Sinai that my family owns. 2 of my best men and women, who are trained combat medics, are with her round the clock." Noel stared at the screen, her vision blurring with sudden, overwhelming tears. For the first time in 3 years, the crushing weight of Maya's safety lifted from her shoulders. She covered her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. Tai-Sik pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket and gently pressed it into her hand. He did not mock her tears or tell her to stop crying. He simply stood there as a solid, unmovable shield. "Richard sent a 4-man crew to Malibu an hour ago." Tai-Sik continued, his voice dropping into a lethal silken whisper. "They found an empty bed. Ji-hoon left a message for them on the wall. They know she is gone, and they know I have her. Richard has lost his leverage." Noel wiped her eyes, her sorrow instantly transmuting into a white-hot fury. She looked up at the Korean boss, the tear tracks drying on her face. "Give me a laptop," she demanded, her voice hard. "He thinks he has until the banks open on Monday to move the money. He doesn't know I built a back door into his routing software." A dark, dangerous smirk touched the corner of Tai-Sik's mouth. He gestured to the workstation. "It is all yours, my dear." For the next 6 hours, the penthouse was silent, save for the furious, rhythmic clacking of the keyboard. Noel was a virtuoso, and the financial network of the Belmont Syndicate was her instrument. She bypassed Richard's 2-factor authentication, spoofed his IP address to make it look like the commands were coming from his Hollywood Hills compound, and began the systematic draining of his empire. She didn't just steal the money, She erased his safety nets. She redirected the 2 million he had skimmed from the Kangpai straight back into Taisik's accounts with a hefty 20% interest penalty. Then she took Richard's personal slush funds, the millions he used to pay off corrupt judges, politicians, and the LAPD, and funneled them into an untraceable dark web crypto tumbler. By 3 p.m., Richard Belmont, the arrogant underboss who had sent her as a fat joke, was financially destitute. "It's done," Noel said, leaning back in the ergonomic leather chair, stretching her arms. He has exactly $400 left in his checking account. The syndicate's operational funds are paralyzed. His men won't get paid on Friday. Taisik, who had been quietly reading a dossier on the couch, closed the folder. He looked at the screens, verifying the zeros across the board. "Brilliant," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers with a burning intensity. "You are an absolute artist, Noel." "What happens now?" she asked, her heart racing under his gaze. "Now," Taisik stood up, checking his platinum Patek Philippe watch. "Now we go to a party, and we watch him bleed." The annual Founders Gala at the Walt Disney Concert Hall was the crown jewel of Los Angeles high society. It was ostensibly a charity event, but in reality, it was where the city's elite, both legitimate and underground, mingled brokered deals and flaunted their untouchable wealth. Richard Belmont was supposed to be the guest of honor, a public relations stunt to legitimize his family's violent reign. Taisik had a different plan. When the blacked-out Maybach pulled up to the red carpet, the paparazzi flashes went into a frenzy. Taisik stepped out first, looking like a god of war poured into a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. But the real shockwave hit the crowd when he reached back into the car and offered his hand. Noel emerged, and the collective breath of the red carpet hitched. Taisik had brought in a team of stylists earlier that afternoon, instructing them to spare no expense. Noel was wearing a custom off-the-shoulder ruby red gown that hugged every curve of her body like it was painted on. A dramatic thigh-high slit revealed her long, powerful legs, and a diamond choker rested against her collarbone. Her hair was styled in cascading, voluminous curls. She looked regal, fiercely beautiful, and completely untouchable. She felt a moment of insecurity as the cameras flashed the old voices of Richard and his men echoing in her head. But Taisik's hand slid to the small of her back, his grip firm and grounding. "Head high, Noel," he murmured against her ear, sending a shiver down her spine. "You are the most dangerous woman in this city. Let them see it." They walked into the grand foyer, parting the sea of billionaires and socialites like royalty. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Kangpai boss rarely attended public events, and he never brought a +1, let alone a stunning black woman who radiated an aura of lethal intelligence. It didn't take long for Richard to spot them. He was standing by the champagne tower, flanked by his remaining sycophants. When his eyes landed on Noel, the colour drained entirely from his face. He looked from her to Taisik, his mind visibly struggling to process the visual. He had sent her to be humiliated. Instead, she was on the arm of his greatest rival, looking like a queen. Anger quickly replaced his shock. Richard was a man who acted on impulse, blinded by his own ego. He shoved past a state senator and stormed across the marble floor, his face flushed red with rage. "Quan!" Richard barked loud enough to silence the surrounding conversations. The classical quartet playing in the corner abruptly stopped. The room went deadly quiet. "What the hell is this? You think you can parade my property into my event?" Taisik didn't flinch. He slowly took a sip of his champagne, his dark eyes fixed on Richard with terrifying amusement. "Your property?" Taisik asked, his voice echoing perfectly in the acoustically flawless hall. "I see a brilliant woman who severed her ties with a sinking ship. You should be thanking her, Richard. She is the only reason your syndicate lasted this long." You stealing my accountant doesn't erase the fact that you owe me respect, Richard spat, stepping into Taysik's personal space. I owe you nothing, Taysik said softly. Especially not after you attempted to insult me by sending Ms. Dubois as a joke. You thought her body was a punchline. You thought her presence was a weakness. Taysik smoothly handed his champagne glass to a passing waiter without looking. But you see, Richard, my vision is not obscured by bigotry and superficial stupidity. I saw exactly what she is. A genius. And today that genius took everything you have. Richard let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. What are you talking about? Check your phone, Richard. Noel spoke up. Her voice was steady, resonant, and dripping with newly found confidence. Richard glared at her, but the absolute certainty in her eyes made him falter. He reached into his tuxedo jacket, pulling out his phone. He opened his encrypted banking app. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight. Richard's face went from red to stark white to a sickly shade of grey. His hands began to shake violently. 0, he whispered, staring at the screen. The offshore accounts. The payroll. He looked up at Noel, his eyes wide with a pure, unadulterated panic. What did you do, you bitch? He lunged for her. He didn't make it 2 steps. Ji-hoon, who had been blending flawlessly into the crowd, materialized from the shadows. He grabbed Richard by the throat, slamming him brutally onto the marble table holding the champagne tower. Hundreds of crystal glasses shattered, raining down like ice, drenching Richard in expensive alcohol as he gasped for air. Gasps erupted from the elite crowd, but no one moved. No security guards intervened. Taysik owned half the people in this room, and the other half were terrified of him. Taysik casually walked over to where Richard was pinned, leaning down, so only Richard and Noel could hear him. You sent her as a joke. Taysik whispered, his eyes entirely black, devoid of mercy. And she just turned your entire life into a punchline. You have no money. You have no leverage. By tomorrow morning, the families in New York will know you lost the West Coast Treasury, and they will send a crew to hollow you out. Taysik stood up, adjusting his cuffs. You are a dead man walking, Richard. Enjoy the gala. Taysik turned back to Noel, offering his arm once again. She looked down at Richard, thrashing pathetically among the broken glass, stripped of his power, his arrogance, and his empire. A deep, satisfying warmth spread through her chest. She took Taysik's arm, and together they walked out of the concert hall, leaving the burning ruins of the Belmont Empire in their wake. The fallout from the Walt Disney Concert Hall Gala was immediate and absolute. Within 48 hours, the Belmont Syndicate, a fixture in Los Angeles for 3 decades, had completely evaporated. Richard Belmont was found weeping in a motel room in Barstow, utterly bankrupt, before being quietly escorted back to New York by men who did not smile. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the criminal underworld even more so. The sudden collapse of the West Coast's largest Italian-American syndicate sent shockwaves all the way to the East Coast. The 5 families in New York, who had relied on Richard's monthly tributes, were not just angry, they were hemorrhaging money, and they wanted answers. They sent Vincent Corvino. Vincent was a cleaner for the commission. Operating out of a sleek corporate front in Manhattan, he was a ruthless Ivy League-educated sociopath who hid behind tailored Bryony suits and a veneer of corporate legality. When his Gulfstream G650 touched down at LAX, his mission was twofold: recover the lost millions and eliminate the architect of the Belmont collapse. He expected to find a typical mob war. What he found instead was an impenetrable fortress built by an accountant. Back at the Ritz-Carlton penthouse, Noel was thriving. The guest suite, had been entirely converted into a state-of-the-art command center. 6 monitors had become 12. Servers hummed quietly in the corner, cooling systems, masking the sound of billions of dollars being meticulously laundered, diversified and buried deep within legitimate Korean tech conglomerates and real estate trusts. She sat in the center of it all, her natural hair pulled into a thick, glorious puff, wearing a plush white cashmere sweater that contrasted beautifully with her deep, flawless brown skin. She was reviewing the quarterly projections for Taesik's maritime shipping company when the heavy mahogany door opened. Taesik walked in. Even in the sanctity of his own home, he moved with the silent, coiled energy of a predator. He had taken off his suit jacket, his white dress shirt rolled up to the elbows, revealing the intricate ink of dragons and tigers that spiraled down his forearms. He placed a steaming mug of jasmine tea on the desk beside her keyboard. "You haven't slept, Noel." Taesik noted his deep voice, a soothing rumble in the quiet room. "I slept," Noel lied, not taking her eyes off the screen. "For at least 3 hours. Look at this, Taesik. I've routed the last of the Belmont slush funds through the Cayman shell companies and integrated them into your sole tech front. The money is entirely clean. We've increased your operational liquidity by 40% in 3 days. Taesik didn't look at the screens. He looked at her. He reached out his large, calloused hand, gently covering hers, stilling her furious typing. "The money is irrelevant if the mind behind it burns out," he said softly. Noel finally looked up, her breath catching slightly in her throat. The physical proximity to him always did this to her. It wasn't just his striking, harsh beauty. It was the way he looked at her. For her entire life, men had looked at her with either dismissive cruelty or fetishized curiosity. Taesik looked at her like she was the only fixed point in his universe. Like she was a queen he was sworn to protect. "I'm fine," she murmured, her pulse quickening as his thumb traced the knuckles of her hand. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. The commission in New York isn't going to just let the West Coast go." Taesik's eyes darkened, a flash of something lethal crossing his features. "Vincent Corvino landed in Los Angeles this morning. He has set up operations in Century City." Noel stiffened. "Corvino. I know that name. He was the one auditing Richard's books from the East Coast. He's dangerous, Taesik. He's not a meathead like Richard. He's a financial predator." He requested a parley. Taesik said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Tonight, at the Griffith Observatory." "Are you going?" "I am." Taesik released her hand, though the ghost of his touch lingered on her skin. "He will demand the money back. He will demand concessions, and when I refuse, he will threaten war." Noel's mind raced, the gears turning at lightning speed. "Wait," she said, pulling up a hidden encrypted file on her main monitor. "When I was hacking Richard's mainframe, I didn't just take his money, I took his archives. Richard kept detailed ledgers of his tributes to New York. Corvino has been skimming off the top before handing the money to the commission. Millions over the last 5 years. Taesik slowly leaned over her shoulder, his chest brushing against her back, sending a jolt of electricity down her spine. He read the numbers glowing on the screen. A slow, dark smile spread across his face. "You, Noel Dubois." Taesik whispered, his lips grazing the shell of her ear. "Are the most terrifying weapon I possess." The Griffith Observatory was closed to the public, the iconic white domes glowing under the Los Angeles moonlight. The panoramic view of the sprawling, glittering city below was breathtaking, but neither of the men standing on the observation deck cared about the scenery. Taesik stood by the railing, flanked only by Ji-hoon. He wore a long, tailored black wool overcoat, the collar turned up against the chill wind. Approaching him was Vincent Corvino, surrounded by 6 heavily armed ex-military contractors. Corvino looked every bit the Wall Street shark, slicked back hair, a cashmere scarf, and a smile that didn't reach his cold reptilian eyes. Quan. Corvino greeted, his voice smooth and condescending. I must say I admire the efficiency. Belmont was an embarrassment. But you stepped out of line. The West Coast territory belongs to the Commission. The territory belongs to whoever has the strength to hold it, Tasic replied calmly, not turning around to face him. Corvino chuckled, stepping closer. Let's skip the posturing. You have $6 million that belongs to my employers. And more importantly, you have a rogue asset, the accountant, Dubois. At the mention of Noel's name, the air around Tasic seemed to freeze. Ji-hoon's hand drifted toward his coat. I am willing to offer a generous compromise. Corvino continued, blind to the sudden shift in the atmosphere. You return the $6 million. You hand over the black girl. The Commission will let you keep the shipping lanes in Long Beach, and we avoid a war that will drown this city in blood. Tasic finally turned. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated menace. You refer to her as an asset, Tasic said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating frequency. You think she is a ledger to be traded, a piece of property. She's an employee who stole from us, Corvino scoffed. And she's going to spend the rest of her life in a windowless room in Staten Island, untangling our offshore accounts. Hand her over, Quan. No. Corvino sighed, shaking his head. I expected you to be difficult, but you don't understand the game you're playing. I don't just use guns, Quan. I use banks. Corvino pulled out his phone. I have the routing numbers to your legitimate tech fronts in Seoul. As we speak, my associates at the Federal Reserve are freezing your primary liquidity pipelines under the Patriot Act. You are going to be penniless in 3 minutes. Tasic didn't panic. He simply pulled his own phone from his pocket and pressed a single button, putting it on speakerphone. Noel, Tasic said into the quiet night air. I'm here. Her voice rang out clear, confident, and dripping with authority. Corvino frowned, looking at the phone. What is this, Mister? Corvino Noel's voice echoed from the device. You seem to be having trouble connecting to your friends at the Federal Reserve. That's because I rerouted your servers through a phantom node in Belarus about 20 minutes ago. Corvino's smug smile vanished. Listen to me, you little... No, you listen to me. Noel interrupted her tone, turning to steel. While you were busy trying to freeze Tasic's accounts, I was busy looking into yours. Specifically, a Cayman Islands trust fund under the name Aegis Capital. The one where you've been hiding the 20% you've been skimming from the Commission's tributes for the last 5 years. The colour drained entirely from Corvino's face. His contractors shifted nervously, sensing their boss's sudden paralysing fear. I took the liberty of compiling a very detailed, heavily corroborated PDF of your extracurricular theft, Noel continued, and 5 seconds ago, I emailed it directly to the heads of the 5 families in New York, along with the GPS coordinates of your current location. Corvino stared at the phone in absolute horror. He was dead. If the Commission knew he was stealing from them, they wouldn't just kill him. They would erase his entire bloodline. You bluffing bitch, Corvino whispered, his voice trembling. Check your email, Vincent, Noel said coldly, and tell the Commission that the West Coast is closed for business. Goodbye. The line went dead. Tasic looked at the broken man standing before him. Corvino's phone began to vibrate violently in his hand. It was a New York area code. The Commission was calling. Corvino looked up at Tasic, his eyes wide with terror. Quan, please, if I answer this, I'm dead. I have money. I can pay you. "I don't need your money," Taisik said, turning his back on Corvino and looking out over the glittering expanse of Los Angeles. He had just conquered the entire West Coast without firing a single shot, all thanks to the woman waiting for him back at the penthouse. Taisik looked over his shoulder, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Answer your phone, Vincent, and never disrespect my queen again." The destruction of Vincent Corvino was a surgical, bloodless strike that should have ended the war before a single shot was fired. For a tense, suffocating week, Los Angeles was eerily quiet. The 5 families of New York, specifically the remnants of the old guard Colombo and Genovese crime structures from which Corvino had been secretly skimming, were thrown into absolute chaos. Noel's meticulously leaked dossier had triggered a ruthless internal purge on the East Coast, but peace in the underworld is always a fragile, fleeting illusion. While the commission heads in Manhattan were busy restructuring their fractured hierarchy, a rogue faction of Corvino's most fanatic loyalists decided to strike back. They were ex-paramilitary contractors, men who had traded government pensions for dark money. They didn't care about the lost millions anymore. They cared about blood reputation and the absolute burning humiliation of being completely outsmarted by a black female accountant operating 3,000 miles away. It happened on a Tuesday night. A torrential, unseasonable California squall was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass of the Ritz-Carlton penthouse. Inside the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the violence of the storm. The sprawling suite smelled of expensive jasmine tea and the faint metallic hum of high-end servers. Taisik was in the expansive drawing room with Ji-hoon leaning over a massive mahogany table illuminated by the soft glow of a brushed brass desk lamp. He was wearing dark slacks and a tailored white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, to reveal the intricate swirling ink of dragons and tigers that cascaded down his forearms. They were reviewing a series of complex maritime shipping manifests for the Port of Oakland. Meanwhile, in the master suite, Noel was experiencing a rare moment of profound, unadulterated joy. She sat cross-legged on the massive king-size bed, wearing a plush, oversized cashmere sweater that slipped casually off one shoulder, her natural hair pulled into a voluminous, gorgeous puff. Her laptop was open, and the screen displayed the bright, smiling face of her sister. Maya's color had fully returned since her emergency transfer to the Cedars-Sinai private wing. She was laughing, her voice a melody that chased away the shadows of the past 3 years. "I'm telling you, Noel." Maya grinned, taking a sip from a hospital-issued juice box. "The nurses here are basically ninjas. One of them caught a falling tray without even looking. I think Taisik actually hired an elite guard detail and just put them in scrubs." Noel chuckled, a warm, genuine sound. "I wouldn't put it past him. He takes his security very seriously. Just focus on your rest, okay? The doctors said your white blood cell count is climbing. You might be able to leave the facility by next month." Next month. Maya breathed, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Freedom. Because of you." "Because of us," Noel corrected gently. Suddenly the screen glitched. A sharp digital artifacting tore across Maya's face, and then the laptop died entirely. The ambient warm lighting of the master suite vanished. The low hum of the climate control system ground to a halt. The entire penthouse plunged into pitch-black darkness, save for the jagged, violent flashes of lightning illuminating the skyline outside. Noel's heart slammed against her ribs, but the panic lasted only a fraction of a second. 3 years under the thumb of Richard Belmont had taught her to endure terror, but a week operating beside Taisik Kwon had taught her how to weaponize it. Instantly, the heavy, reinforced oak double doors of the penthouse entryway burst open with a deafening crash. Silencers hissed in the dark, a deadly thwip-thwip-thwip that sounded like tearing silk. The horrifying sound of priceless vases and glass tables shattering echoed through the massive cavernous space as 12 heavily armed mercenaries flooded the foyer. They were wearing matte black tactical gear, Kevlar plating, and advanced multi-lens night vision goggles. They had bypassed the hotel's localized security grid, disabled the private elevator shafts, and scaled the exterior service ladders in the pouring rain. It was a suicide mission, but they were determined to drag Tae-sik and his queen straight to hell with them. In the master suite, Noel rolled silently off the mattress. She hit the floor, her bare feet silent against the Persian rug. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She reached directly under the mahogany nightstand, her fingers blindly tracing the wood until she found the hidden biometric lockbox. It popped open with a quiet click. She pulled out the emergency tablet. It was a device Tae-sik had insisted on, a ruggedized, hardwired terminal connected directly into the building's closed-circuit physical infrastructure, completely independent of the compromised Wi-Fi. The screen glowed to life, illuminating her face in a harsh, pale blue light. Outside the bedroom, the penthouse had devolved into an absolute war zone. Tae-sik was a lethal ghost in the darkness. Without the aid of night vision, he relied purely on primal instinct, flawless spatial awareness, and decades of brutal training. He moved seamlessly from cover to cover behind the marble pillars. A mercenary rounded the corner near the kitchen. Tae-sik disarmed the man in a terrifying blur of motion, stripping the assault rifle away, before driving a karambit knife directly through the vulnerable gap in the man's body armor. He swept the mercenary's leg, dropping him silently to the floor, before vaulting over the kitchen island as a hail of suppressed bullets chewed the marble into dust. Ji-hoon was pinned behind a massive leather sectional, providing precise suppressing fire with his sidearm, but they were severely outgunned. The mercenaries were advancing with terrifying systematic military precision. They were clearing rooms, communicating through silent hand signals, moving steadily toward the master suite, where they knew the architect of their downfall was hiding. "I need eyes, Noel!" Tae-sik roared over the deafening crack of gunfire, his deep voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, commanding the chaos. Sitting in the dark, her fingers flying across the emergency tablet at lightning speed, Noel hacked directly into the Ritz-Carlton's smart building management system. She couldn't restore the main electrical grid, they had physically cut the lines, but she could override the localized environmental controls. She analyzed the variables. Night vision goggles amplified available light by tens of thousands of times. It made the dark visible, but it also made sudden extreme light an absolute weakness. "Cover your ears and close your eyes," Noel screamed back through the thin drywall. Tae-sik and Ji-hoon didn't hesitate. They instantly dropped flat against the floor, burying their faces in their arms. Noel bypassed the penthouse's fire suppression limits and accessed the emergency strobe alarms. She didn't just activate them, she stripped the safety protocols and maxed out the frequencies. With a final decisive tap on the glass screen, she executed the command. Instantly, deafening high-decibel fire sirens shrieked through the penthouse, a mechanical scream that echoed painfully in the enclosed space, rattling the teeth in their skulls. Simultaneously, the emergency industrial strobe lights, hidden in the architectural ceiling, molding began flashing at a blinding rapid-fire speed. For the mercenaries wearing highly sensitive light-amplifying optics, the sudden blast of intense flashing light was like staring directly into a supernova. Several of the men screamed in genuine agony, tearing their tactical helmets off, clawing at their eyes as they were completely blinded and severely disoriented by the agonizing wail of the sirens. Their military formation instantly crumbled into blind, staggering chaos. It was the only opening the king of the Kangpai needed. With the enemy blinded and deafened, Tae-sik and Ji-hoon rose from the floor. They moved like reapers through the flashing strobe lights. The combat that followed was brutal, swift, and completely devoid of mercy. Tasic fought with a terrifying, devastating elegance, dismantling the hit squad one by one. In less than 60 seconds, the marble floors were slick with blood, and the threat was entirely neutralized. When the last mercenary fell, the backup generators finally kicked in with a heavy mechanical thud. The sirens abruptly cut off. The strobes died. The warm ambient lighting flooded back into the ruined penthouse. Bullet holes riddled the priceless artwork. Shattered glass covered the floors like a layer of dangerous ice. Tasic stood in the absolute center of the carnage, his broad chest heaving. His pristine white shirt was stained crimson, though none of it was his own. He slowly dropped the empty magazine from his sidearm, the metal clattering loudly against the tiles. He looked toward the hallway. Noel stepped out of the master suite. She was barefoot, still clutching the emergency tablet against her chest. Her eyes swept over the horrific devastation, the smoke hanging in the air, and the bodies scattered across the floor. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away in horror. She walked straight through the wreckage, her gaze locked entirely on the man standing in the center of it all. Tasic closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He dropped his weapon and pulled her fiercely against his chest, his large hands buried into her thick, beautiful hair, pressing her face into the crook of his neck. He breathed in the scent of her, the rapid racing of her pulse, confirming she was alive, unharmed and perfectly safe. "You saved us," Tasic whispered, his voice thick with a raw, desperate emotion the criminal underworld had never heard from him. "You brilliant, beautiful woman. You saved us." Noel wrapped her arms tightly around his waist, leaning into his solid, unyielding strength, her ear pressed against his chest to hear the steady, strong rhythm of his heart. She closed her eyes, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb. "We save each other, Tasic," she murmured into his shirt, her voice steady and absolute. "That's the deal." Phew. It was one thing to win a war with bullets, shattered glass, and blinding strobe lights. It was an entirely different, vastly more complicated beast to legitimize a conquered underworld. But if there was one thing Noel Dubois knew better than anyone on Earth, it was how to balance a ledger no matter how much blood was soaked into the margins. 6 months after the siege at the Ritz-Carlton, the violent, messy, and arrogant reign of the Belmont family was nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in the dark corners of Los Angeles. The Kangpai had evolved from a shadowy, terrifying syndicate into the Quan conglomerate, a globally recognized multi-billion-dollar corporate empire that seamlessly blended international underground logistics with highly lucrative legitimate tech real estate and maritime shipping ventures. And at the very apex of this staggering mountain of wealth and power sat Noel Dubois. She was no longer the brilliant but invisible accountant hiding in the back office of a Hollywood Hills compound, desperately trying to keep a sinking ship afloat. She was officially the chief financial officer of the Quan conglomerate, holding 50% voting power across all corporate boards. Her newfound authority was tested on a crisp Tuesday morning in a glass-walled boardroom high above Century City. Around the massive custom-built mahogany table sat 20 men. Half were legitimate Wall Street investment bankers. The other half were old guard, mob lieutenants, remnants of the New York Commission's West Coast operations, who had wisely chosen to bend the knee rather than share Vincent Corvino's unmarked grave. Noel stood at the head of the table, wearing a razor-sharp, tailored ivory pantsuit that contrasted flawlessly with her deep brown skin. Her natural hair was styled in an intricate regal crown of braids. She projected the quarterly earnings for the Long Beach port expansion onto the smart screen behind her. The transition from unregulated extortion to automated tariff-compliant maritime shipping has increased our net revenue by 34%. Noel stated, her voice projecting with absolute, unshakable confidence. However, Sector 4 is lagging. The overhead is inflated. Dominic Russo, a grizzled, thick-necked capo who had survived the purge, leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms. He still struggled with taking orders from a woman, let alone a black woman who used to fetch coffee for Richard Belmont. With all due respect, Ms. Dubois. Russo grumbled, his Brooklyn accent thick and patronizing. You can't run the docks like a spreadsheet. We have human resources that require discretionary funds. You squeeze the foreman too hard, they strike. The math doesn't always translate to the streets. The boardroom went dead silent. The Wall Street bankers held their breath. Sitting to Noel's immediate right, Taisik Kwon did not move. He was dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit, his dark, calculating eyes resting casually on Russo. He didn't intervene. He didn't need to. He simply watched his queen work. Noel didn't blink. She slowly closed her leather folio and pinned Russo with a stare so cold it could have frozen the Pacific. Mr. Russo, Noel said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. I am intimately aware of how the streets work. I am also intimately aware that your discretionary funds are being funneled into an offshore betting ring in Macau. I have the wire transfers time-stamped and cross-referenced with your personal IP address. Russo's smug expression vanished, replaced instantly by a sickly pale terror. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting briefly to Taisik, who offered him nothing but a cold, anticipating smile. I don't make suggestions, Dominic. Noel continued, leaning forward, resting her hands on the table. I make forecasts, and if Sector 4 doesn't meet this projected forecast by Q3, I won't just audit your books, I will erase them, and then I will let Mr. Kwon audit you. Do we have a mathematical consensus? Russo wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, looking down at his lap. Yes, Ms. Dubois, understood. Excellent. Noel said smoothly, opening her folio again without missing a beat, moving on to the tech acquisitions in Seoul. After the meeting, as the executives and capos scrambled out of the room, Taisik stood up and walked over to her. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. You are terrifying, he murmured, his voice a low, deeply affectionate rumble. Remind me never to cross you. Noel leaned back into his solid chest, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face. You couldn't afford my late fees, Mr. Kwon. Their life wasn't just built on boardroom dominance, it was built on healing. Later that evening, the couple returned to their sprawling private estate in Malibu, a fortress of glass and teak perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The greatest victory of all wasn't the billions in the bank, it was waiting for them on the terrace. Maya, fully in remission and glowing with health, was sitting on a plush outdoor sofa, a laptop resting on her knees as she completed an online module for her cybersecurity degree. The Kwon conglomerate had funded an entirely new wing for autoimmune research at Cedars-Sinai in her name. Hey, corporate overlords, Maya teased as they walked out onto the terrace. She closed her laptop and stood up, enveloping Noel in a tight hug. Noel squeezed her sister back, inhaling the scent of coconut shampoo and salt air. How are the classes? Boring. Maya laughed, looking over Noel's shoulder at Taisik. I was looking at the network architecture you guys are using for the European routing. It's got a vulnerability in the tertiary firewall. I patched it for you. Taisik chuckled, a sound that was still rare but incredibly warm when directed at the Dubois sisters. I will triple your consulting fee, Maya. Thank you. As Maya went inside to prepare dinner, Noel walked over to the edge of the glass balcony, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the waves below. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the California sky in brilliant strokes of crushed violet burnt orange and spun gold. Tasic joined her, but he didn't look at the sunset. He looked only at her. Noel turned to him, her heart doing the familiar heavy flutter it always did when she caught him staring. Tonight she had changed out of her armour the ivory pantsuit and into a flowing, off-the-shoulder silk dress. It was the exact vibrant shade of emerald green she had worn the night Richard Belmont had sent her to the Onyx Room to die. It was a deliberate choice. A reclamation of the night she stopped being a victim and started being a queen. "What are you thinking about?" Tasic asked softly, his large scarred hand reaching out to gently trace the line of her collarbone. "I was thinking about the punchline." Noel breathed out, stepping closer to him, closing the distance. "I spent my entire adult life trying to shrink myself, Tasic. Trying to make my body take up less space. Trying to quiet my voice. Trying to hide my brilliance so mediocre men wouldn't feel threatened. They looked at a black plus-size woman and saw a joke." Tasic's eyes darkened with a fierce, protective intensity. His hands moved to cup her face, his thumbs gently sweeping across her cheekbones. "They were blind," Tasic vowed, his voice thick with raw devotion. "They lived in the dirt, Noel. They couldn't comprehend the stars. But I saw you. From the second you walked through those doors, I saw the most magnificent, dangerous, and beautiful creature I had ever encountered." He took a step back, the cool ocean breeze whipping around them. But he didn't let go of her hand. Tasic reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sleek black velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. That wasn't the dynamic of their empire. They were absolute equals in every sense of the word, partners in business, in war, and in life. He opened the box. Nestled in the dark velvet was a breathtaking, flawless, emerald-cut diamond ring, flanked by two incredibly rare black diamonds. It was heavy, substantial, and utterly unique, just like her. Noel's breath hitched in her throat. Tears, hot and fast, pricked the corners of her eyes. "Richard Belmont sent you to me as an insult." Tasic said, his voice dropping into a steady, resonant vow that vibrated in her chest. "But you were my salvation. You silenced the room that night, Noel. And then you silenced every demon I had ever known. You brought light into my shadows, and you built a kingdom from the ashes of our enemies." He took her left hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, his intense dark eyes stripping away the ruthless Mafia boss to reveal the man who was completely and irrevocably in love. "Rule this empire with me." Tasic asked his words, carrying the weight of a lifelong promise. "Rule my heart. Rule my life. Marry me, Noel." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling so hard her face ached. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph and overwhelming love. She looked at the man who had never asked her to change a single thing about herself. The man who had handed her the world on a silver platter because he knew she was strong enough to hold it. "Only if I get to keep managing the books," Noel whispered, her voice trembling beautifully with joy. Tasic let out a deep, genuine laugh that echoed over the crashing waves. He slid the heavy, magnificent ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. "The books, the men, the city, it all belongs to you." He pulled her in, capturing her lips in a deep, searing and passionate kiss as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. The shadows stretched over Los Angeles, but Noel Dubois was no longer afraid of the dark. She was the matriarch of it. The joke had become the empress, and the underworld would never be the same again. What a journey. From being sent into the lion's den as a cruel, fat-phobic joke to outsmarting the entire New York Commission and becoming the undisputed queen of the West Coast underworld, Noel's story proves that true power lies in intellect resilience and refusing to shrink yourself for anyone. If you loved watching Noel and Tasic tear down the Belmont Empire and build their own, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs an epic story of revenge and romance, and subscribe to the channel. We have so many more thrilling, drama-filled stories coming your way. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below. Which moment was your favourite? The gala takedown or the strobe light penthouse trap? See you in the next one.